Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. This is Opening the Tap, Peru's Silent Revolution on Nature-Based Solutions, hosted by Forest Trends. My name is Cheyenne Coxon, and I am Senior Communications Associate at Forest Trends. I have a couple of really quick notes before I hand things off to our moderator. The first is that this session is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording in a couple of days. I will also be sending a follow-up message with the link to the recording and also access to the report that inspired the webinar. So the second thing is that if you have any questions for panelists as we're moving through the session, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A box, and the moderator and I will be able to go through and see those after our panelists have finished their remarks. So thank you very much for coming. I see lots of folks still tuning in. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Bettina von Hagen. And she is CEO and Managing Director of BFM Investments and Advisory and co-chair of the Forest Trends Board of Directors. Bettina, thank you for being here.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining us for this special webinar. As Cheyenne mentioned, I'm a longtime member and co-chair of Forest Trends, but most relevant to the discussion today, I am a very proud Peruvian American. Peru's pre-Inca and Inca civilizations were stunning engineers and practitioners of nature-based approaches to water management, which was so crucial to agriculture in the high Andes. It is thrilling to watch Peru reclaim center stage on nature-based solutions to water management. The COP26 climate talks marked a sea change in global commitments to nature-based solutions for climate, and especially the interest in the potential of nature to support water and climate resilience. However, few examples exist of successful mainstreaming nature-based solutions at scale. For example, how can countries move from small projects to national implementation? How can leaders create an enabling environment for investment? And how can public infrastructure investments successfully integrate nature-based strategies? Peru offers one of the best cases in the world for answering these questions, although until recently, it has gotten little attention on the world stage for its leadership on nature-based solutions. And we'd like to change that today. In this webinar, we'll share the story of how Peru transformed its infrastructure sector in just a few short years, and the specific steps taken by the diverse actors that made it possible. We'll also feature results from a new report that documents the current scale, scope, and direction of investments in nature-based solutions for water and climate resilience in Peru. This webinar is the first of two. This one describes the current state of natural water infrastructure in Peru, and the next one on March 10th will focus on how this approach can be further expanded and adopted in other countries. Forest Trends works to scale up natural water infrastructure investments in Peru through our Natural Infrastructure for Water Security project, which is funded and supported by the United States Agency for International Development and the Government of Canada. The report we'll present today and this webinar are possible only because of their support. We're grateful today to have representatives of each agency joining us. Please help me welcome Gillian Caldwell, Chief Climate Officer and Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, for opening remarks. Gillian?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Bettina. Well, yes, I'm Gillian Caldwell, and I just began as USAID's Chief Climate Officer. And I don't need to tell people on this call that climate change is really presenting substantial threats to development progress and, of course, exacerbating global inequities and increasing food and water scarcity and the need for the humanitarian assistance that we provide. Since 2000, climate-related disasters have affected almost 4 billion people around the world with an estimated cost of more than 2.2 trillion. And the estimates are pretty dire. Without urgent action, climate change could push an additional 100 million into poverty by 2030. And that's why USAID is planning a really all hands on deck response to the crisis between now and 2030. We've set 6 ambitious high-level goals for ourselves: reducing 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, preserving 100 million hectares mobilizing $150 billion for public and private climate finance, improving the resilience of 500 million people, and working closely in the 80 countries where we have missions to support those countries to deliver on their NDCs and their NAPs. But the focus of today's conversation is water, because due to the climate crisis, there is also a water crisis. Almost 90% of the disasters arising from climate change are related to water, and up to 5 billion people could face water scarcity by 2050, leading to a broad range of threats to development and security. Peru is an especially vulnerable country to the impacts of climate change. The ecosystems that provide water regulating services in the high Andes are under increased human pressure due to overgrazing, deforestation, expansion of the agricultural frontier, and degradation of vegetation cover and soil quality. That is all, of course, threatening the natural water retention release capacity of the soils. And at USAID Peru, we've been very honored to work with Peruvian leaders from national ministries to local communities to develop and implement innovative solutions to address these impacts. Recognizing the opportunity for natural infrastructure as opposed to gray infrastructure, such as forests and wetlands, to help communities adapt to climate change, USAID and the Government of Canada support the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security project implemented by Forest Trends and its partners. This project entered partway through a period of extraordinary financial transition documented in the Opening the Tap report, which we'll hear about today. And the project builds on many of the regulatory shifts and financial commitments that have been made by visionary Peruvian leaders. Investments in watersheds focused on conserving and restoring ecosystems are crucial to water security in the long term. These investments, leadership, and institutional capacity have the potential to deliver long-term benefits to people's communities, cities, and ecosystems. Today, we'll hear about the efforts and results of the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security project, and hope others will find valuable models and lessons for scaling up nature-based solutions for climate resilience around the world. Thank you all so much for joining, and look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Gillian, and so appreciate your nuanced understanding of natural infrastructure and your support for this project. We're also very happy to have our colleagues from the Government of Canada here today. Let me now invite Isabel Blanco, Councillor and Head of Cooperation for Global Affairs Canada and Peru, to share the Canadian perspective on this important topic with us. Isabel?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bettina. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar on behalf of the Government of Canada. From 2018 to 2020, Canada participated in the Global Commission on Adaptation, co-leading with Mexico the Action Track on Nature-Based Solutions. For our role in the Commission and more broadly in our development and diplomatic efforts globally, Canada has emphasized the human, environmental, and economic imperatives of acting decisively to adapt to climate change. A flagship report by the Commission highlighted nature-based solutions as one of the clear strategies for increasing climate resilience. The same report identified access to finance as a key barrier that impedes the scaling up of nature-based solutions for adaptation in many countries. Peru offers a fantastic case study on how to dismantle these barriers to financing nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. As we'll see today, in the last 10 years, Peru has made extraordinary financial commitments to natural infrastructure as a strategy for managing climate risks. And with the support of a range of actors, it has systematically addressed many of the institutional barriers to get that finance at work on the ground. I'd like to echo Gillian's comments in saying that for Canada, it's a great opportunity and pleasure to collaborate with the United States on the innovative natural infrastructure for water security project since 2017, and in partnership led with Forest Trends. Through this project, we work with a consortium that involves many Peruvian partners to help follow through on the promise that we'll see laid out today, addressing remaining barriers to real action on the ground and making tangible progress for advancing effective, sustainable, and equitable nature-based solutions for adaptation. Gender inequality, climate vulnerability, and state fragility are strongly interrelated. Canada's feminist international assistance policy, embodied in all the projects it supports, recognizes that empowering women helps them, their families, and their countries become more prosperous in a virtuous circle. Women are a powerful force for building safer and stronger societies in all fields. The natural infrastructure for water security project is no exception to this. We're particularly pleased that our efforts through the project allow us to work directly on reducing gender inequalities, which we know are incompatible with a climate secure future. We look forward to today's discussion, and we'd like to thank the audience and all the panelists for joining us in this important event today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And the focus on gender equity in water infrastructure, I think will have reverberations not only for this project, but far beyond, and are so appreciated. Now I'm very happy to introduce Jenna Gami, Deputy Director of the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security Project in Peru with Forest Trends. Jenna is also co-author of the report, Opening the Tap, State of Finance for Natural Infrastructure for Water Security in Peru, which as of today is available in English as well as the original Spanish. Jenna will share the main findings of the report with us as a starting point for our discussion today. Jenna?
Thank you, Bettina, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to, as we said, start to put Peru more clearly on the map internationally for its leadership on nature-based solutions for water. So my job today is to share the main findings of this report on what has actually been happening for finance of natural infrastructure for water security in Peru over the last 10 years. And I'd like to just acknowledge we've mentioned a couple of times the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security project in Peru. We'll share the link where you all can learn more about that project online. But so it's implemented. I'd like to mention that it's mentioned by a consortium led by Forest Trends and also with our Peruvian partners, Condesan and the Peruvian Society for Environmental Law, as well as international partners, Ecodecisión and Imperial College London. So to start off, it's important to recognize that Peru is highly vulnerable to water and climatic extremes, as we've mentioned today. And I just like to start with this slide that highlights first the broad diversity in ecosystems and climates in Peru. We have desert on the coast, Andean mountain range, and then the Amazon, three very distinct climates and a number of subclimates within each of those areas. And then so water is unevenly distributed in space across the country. It's also unevenly distributed in time. And this is part of what generates a lot of water risks. Some parts of the year, obviously, when it rains, we have a lot of water, and that creates certain risks like flooding and landslides. And then in other parts of the year, there are deficits that create water scarcity. And so it's that variability that is expected to intensify with climate change that exacerbates, along with land use change and population growth, a number of water risks in Peru. We also are losing important natural infrastructure that has helped to mitigate some of these extremes in the past, like tropical glaciers that are rapidly disappearing, also as a result of climate change in Peru. What we're talking about today is natural infrastructure. When we say natural infrastructure, what we mean are ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, grasslands, as well as indigenous technologies such as infiltration canals and permeable microreservoirs and terraces that work with natural infrastructure that help to mitigate these extremes, that infiltrate water, stabilize soils, and have helped Andean peoples and people broadly throughout Peru's current territory over millennia to moderate and thrive amidst the extremes that naturally occur in this part of the world. So what we looked at for this report specifically was what kind of finance has been reaching the ground in Peru to support conservation and restoration of natural infrastructure for water security. So we look to public, private, international cooperation sources of financing. We tried to identify as many of those projects and other financing initiatives as we could, and we included in the report those that finance that directly invest in the ground. So it had to be supporting activities on the ground to restore or conserve practices along the lines of what I've just described, and it had to have an explicit hydrological purpose. So when we look at that, what we find is that in 2020, the last year we were able to analyze for this report, Peru invested about $10 million in natural infrastructure for water security in Peru, obviously dollars equivalent to the local currencies. public financing in the last couple of years has dramatically led this amount of finance. So within this field, regional governments, which are subnational equivalent to state governments, led with almost 86% of funds executed in 2020, followed by local governments, and then the national government with 5%. We also can see international development playing an important role, and that's kind of the sources of financing for that we are able to track. You can see a significant change in the period. So we go all the way back to 2008 and what we've analyzed in this report, but really we start to see a pickup in the investment in 2014. So if we look just at between 2014 and 2020, there's 13 times growth, but really what's happening there is opening up of a sector that previously was a bunch of pilot projects, was relatively small, expanding into a much more significant systematic scaling of investments in natural infrastructure for water security. While 2020 saw around $10 million invested, actually the peak that we saw in this period was $13 million in 2019. We believe that the pandemic had a large impact on the ability to execute funds in 2020, and so we don't see it as an overall peak in the kind of overall trajectory. We would see more likely that this growth that we began to see in the overall period analyzed is more likely to continue in the future. Also, as I mentioned, about 17% of the investments that we tracked came from international cooperation, directly financing initiatives on the ground for natural infrastructure for water security in 2020. And that amount, the percentage is much lower than it was in the first half of the period studied, although the amount vacillates a bit, but is pretty consistent over time. And so what we see here is that international cooperation played an important role to fund pilots and to kind of prime the field for investments in natural infrastructure that was then overtaken by public investments by Peruvian agencies and Peruvian regions in the later years that we were able to study. If we look at what exactly was being financed on the ground, we can see in terms of practices, it's largely reforestation and afforestation, as well as some water harvesting practices that are very common in the Andes, such as infiltration, ditches, and other practices. Also, we see cochas, which are micro reservoirs that are often permeable, and amunas, which are pre-Incan infiltration canals. We can see that most of the finance that we were able to track in this report concentrated in the Andean region. In the report, we do a summary and a bit of a narrative around some of the major regulatory changes that were implemented over the period that we analyzed that allows for this opening that we see in the first graph that I showed. And this is too small to read, so I'll just point you to the report to be able to get all of those details. And I wanted to highlight a few of the really key pieces for us today. So in 2013, Peru passed what's called Modernization of Sanitation Services Law, big law focused on the potable water sector that really had very little to do with natural infrastructure, but included one very small provision that required water utilities to start to look towards watershed conservation as they did their 5-year planning and tariff definition processes. This had a big impact because it started a process in which the National Water Utility Regulator, SUNA, started working with all water utilities in the country to begin engaging in watershed conservation, where that had really not been the case before outside of a few pilots. In 2014, Ministry of Environment leads the development and passage of the MRSE law. So in Spanish, it's Mecanismos de Retribución por Servicios Ecosistémicos. We can translate to compensation mechanisms for ecosystem services, which establishes a pathway for using public funds for ecosystem conservation and restoration based on the value of the ecosystem services that those ecosystems provide, including for water. And then really critically in 2015, the Ministry of Environment collaborated with the Ministry of Economy and Finance to produce a couple of new guidelines, including guidelines for the development of public investment projects for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so this is what really allows the public investment system in Peru to see nature as an asset that is worthy or able to be invested in, similar to gray infrastructure with public investment. And so it creates all of the framework and the legal basis to allow for public investments to go into this space. So now, what are some of the challenges and bottlenecks that we see? So it's a huge win for Peru to be able to use public investment in natural infrastructure. But we also see that this system for public investment that is the majority that's followed in order to implement this finance is lengthy and bureaucratic. It's what is used to build roads and bridges, and it takes a long time to be able to develop the projects and justify what needs to be done. If by the time from when you have an approved project design to when you actually start execution, we found on average it took about 4.5 years, and that doesn't include kind of the beginning work to develop the original project design. So we see a real need to look for more efficient mechanisms there. There's also an execution gap for public investments. We saw this most clearly in 2018, where there is a gap of 45% between what was budgeted to be spent on natural infrastructure for water security and what was actually spent. The gap increased as the growth in this sector increased, which makes sense in terms of kind of a lag in capacities compared to ambition or intention of investment in this space. And we've started to see it decline in 2020, but we think it's an important area to watch and to be aware of in other countries, of kind of a capacity gap that might lag behind financial and political commitments. We also see inconsistent estimates of water benefits. So although all of the investments that we looked at had specific hydrological objectives, there was a not very consistent approach to how to describe or quantify or monitor water benefits in these projects. Makes sense again, as this is a new field, but that's a key area to focus on in terms of challenges. And then there's also a lack of explicit gender focus. So in a lot of, when we look at the textual projects, although we know that there are a lot of women leaders involved in many of these projects in their development, there's not yet a clear and explicit recognition of the differences between men and women in terms of knowledge, participation, roles, and benefits, which we recognize as a risk to the sustainability of the projects evaluated in the study. So when we look also to trends and opportunities, so as I mentioned, the majority of investment that we see in the period that we studied that actually was executed in investments on the ground comes from regional governments, from kind of public good providers. But there's also new entrants into the sector. As I mentioned, water utilities are now systematically looking to support watershed conservation for their source waters, and systematically defining tariff allocations in order to do that. So the tariff allocations have started over the last few years. We didn't see these in the report because they haven't really started to be executed yet. If Peru could really begin to start executing the amount of tariff that is collected each year, it could almost double the amount of investment that we saw executed in 2020. So that's a really important area for growth. We also see the beginnings of Peru kind of bringing all of this to a whole new scale, especially with a program that they have nationally called Reconstruction with Changes. So it's a national disaster reconstruction and a bit of economic recovery program, which includes a natural infrastructure investment portfolio of over $200 million. So with that, we would be seeing really significant growth above and beyond what we had seen so far in the first 10 years that we've analyzed in this study. And then we also see new implementation mechanisms coming online that are able to complement the traditional public investment projects that, as I mentioned, can be very lengthy and bureaucratic, with options that are available within the public investment and public finance more broadly system that can help to accelerate investment while still complying with all of the relevant regulations. There have been some important advances there. We think that there can still be significant advances to address some of the efficiency concerns in mobilizing this finance. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna. That's a fascinating history and current status, and also really interesting reflection on the challenges. And we've had some very interesting questions come in while you were talking that we will get to shortly. But first, I'd like to now introduce the two panelists who will help us reflect on these findings with their perspectives and expertise. We are very fortunate to be joined by Gabriel Quijandría, who is the former Minister of Environment of Peru and current Regional Director for IUCN in Latin America, as well as by Helen Laubenstein, environmental economist with the OECD. Gabriel, let's start with you. You have had a front row seat to the changes described in the report. What can you tell us about how Peru was able to start and sustain this remarkable transition to invest at scale in nature-based solutions for water? And how should we understand Peru's significance in the global context?
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you very much. How much time do I have?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to brief in 5 minutes 20 years of work, because this is something that started back in 2000 when at the National Institute of Natural Resources, the first group of discussion on environmental services was established. We were entering later than other countries in this discussion. We entered later than Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, or Ecuador that have, for instance, FONAC, the first water fund that ever existed in the region. But this process, this needed a maturation, or to be mature, needed a lot of discussions and a lot of involvement. And I think that's part of the particularity that the Peruvian process has. This involvement of some actors that haven't been present in processes happening in other countries. For instance, SUNAS, the water regulator in Peru that has had a main role in generating the conditions for the approach of ecosystem services and those related to hydrological services to be absolutely present and vivid in terms, for instance, of water providers or water utilities in Peru that now have available a formula for them to be able to incorporate this new approach of the role of the ecosystems in their work. As Jenna shown, there have been some regulatory advances that have been very, very important in terms of generating the enabling conditions for this critical mass rich situation that we have right now, and that it's shown in the amount of investment that we've seen that we have reached right now. Other actors that have been important are the Ministry of Economy and Finance that haven't been an easy partner, as you may imagine, but from the environmental authorities, we've been constant in terms of nagging them with the idea on how to incorporate this idea of ecosystem services, nature infrastructure or green infrastructure in their mind frame, and I think this has been a successful process in terms of the incorporation of the concept and the approach natural infrastructure as part of the tools for public investment in the public investment system. There is still a challenge related to implementation. So right now we have the guidelines and we have the demand from the regions happening, for instance, but still the implementation of the specific intervention is still something that is challenging. We've seen it in the process, in the long process we have to be able to get out the money that from Sedapal, from the fund that was generated by the Merece Sedapal, that had some constraints to be invested. So I think that those are some of the challenges and the steps ahead that we have to look for. I think something that is very interesting is also this process of these institutions I've described, and some other ones as Reconstrucción con Cambios. There is this institution in charge of deploying all the response to El Niño that happened in 2017, and the availability for them to go out from their comfort zone and try to understand this new approach and not being familiar in some cases with these aspects in terms of hydrological cycles or the environmental or the ecosystem approach, but the willingness to work and to learn is something that it's important, and this recent willingness to incorporate these skills, but not only let's contract some people to be part of our team, but let's build relationships. Let's work with institutions that know how to work with pastors, how to work in doing research. So I think that's something that explains this success of the Peruvian model. Something that it's happening right now. It's interesting is all this involvement that it's starting to take place with the private sector. The private sector is starting to understand the role, the major role they have in the promotion of these nature-based solutions and how they can take advantage of certain tools that exist, or instruments such as this obras por impuestos, works for taxes, instruments that can help if being applied to natural infrastructure can help the effort that has been shown that it's happening from the public sector, that has been shown by Jenna clearly in her presentation. Now in my position, to end at the regional level in IUCN, I see a lot of opportunities in terms of the replication or replicability of this experience in other countries of the region I'm in charge of, which is South America, and I think that the possibility of taking this experience to other countries with similarities in terms of institutions, in terms of ecosystems, as the one in Peru is very promising. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I mean, that's a really interesting observation that this careful cultivation at SUNAS, at the around the water infrastructure, and also with the Ministry of Economics and Finance, sort of laying that groundwork for natural infrastructure carefully over the years. And then you have a natural disaster like El Niño and all the natural disasters that are happening around the world, that careful cultivation and experience then allows a sort of a leapfrog of that sort of national response towards natural climate solutions. That is just a really interesting observation for other places in the world and how we might expand the nature-based solutions approach. So thank you very much for that. Helen, I'd love to get your take here now, especially with your experience in the OECD's roundtable on financing water, and to address, what's unique about how Peruvian leaders have recognized the importance of natural infrastructure for water in the global context, and what is common with other countries leading on finance for nature-based solutions for water, and what might be replicable in other countries. Helen, please.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you also, Jenna and Gabrielle, for the insights on the development and upscaling, and also the challenges of nature-based solutions in Peru. And I think it's fascinating to hear about this rapid growth of investments in nature-based solutions over the last years. I think you mentioned by 13 times. That's a great figure. And for me, the example of Peru and the different steps you outlined highlight solutions to barriers that we often hear around financing nature-based solutions. During our several OECD roundtable meetings on financing water, which is an international platform for dialogue, stakeholders often report about the barriers they face when trying to take up nature-based solutions. And some of these challenges that we hear are about frameworks, policy frameworks, and regulatory arrangements that limit the use and investments in nature-based solutions. And we hear that regulatory frameworks might contain restrictions related to what can be financed and where and by who. And if we think spatially, many governments or agencies lack the authority to disperse funds outside of their jurisdictions, which could mean a city might have difficulties to invest into forest afforestation further upstream if the forest lies outside of their jurisdiction. Or thinking about what can be financed, if ecosystem services are not seen as an asset class and the benefits cannot be clearly monetized, it might be difficult for authorities to justify an investment in nature-based solutions. And also looking at water utilities, they benefit largely from NBS and therefore have an interest in investing in them. But in many countries, we see that regulatory arrangements or prohibit or limit such investments. For example, due to asset capitalization accounting rules, so that they cannot include a planted or protected forest in their asset base. Or in other countries, the utilities might only be allowed to invest in gray infrastructure. So Peru is an inspiring example that actually highlights how policy reforms and regulation can help overcome such barriers and help allow for investments in ecosystem services as assets. And for example, the compensation mechanism for ecosystem services that Jenna just mentioned briefly, that's a great mechanism to allow local governments to provide funds for interventions elsewhere, upstream, where ecologically it makes most sense. And that is an example that could serve as inspiration for other countries. And we've also seen similar schemes, payment schemes, or pilots in other places in the world. For example, China has set up an eco-compensation scheme pilot between local and local governments up and downstream. Also, the reform that you mentioned, that water utilities can charge their users a new tariff for environmental services, is a great way to allow for and to generate stable funding streams and thus bolster the business case for nature-based solutions. And that definitely can be a source of inspiration for other countries or other contexts. And we already see this in other places, for example, in the in the UK. I think the Peruvian case also shows how reforms and legal frameworks and instruments can help overcome these common challenges and help scaling up investments in nature-based solutions. And OECD work on Peru also confirms that this institutional and legal framework is quite solid and sophisticated, but it also shows, and that's something Gabrielle just mentioned, is that there is maybe a mismatch with the capacity of Peru's institutions to implement the frameworks, and that the sector would benefit from institutional capacity strengthening and enhanced coordination among actors and sectors and ministries. So that could be a way forward to even further scale out nature-based solutions in the country. And maybe as a last point on the question of replicability, that also depends very much on the institutional capacity and enabling environment in the specific context. And it also depends on the ability to measure performance and outcomes of the investments and to capture and quantify benefits. And Jenna, you mentioned that this also remains a challenge in the case of Peru, and it's a challenge that we often hear also from other countries, namely the lack of methodologies to quantify a variety of benefits and to measure and predict performance of natural infrastructure. And working on this and developing and mainstreaming new approaches and appraisal tools that manage to fully account for all direct and indirect benefits of natural infrastructure can bolster the business case for nature-based solutions and can then also help to attract additional funding from a wider range of stakeholders. And also, as Gabrielle mentioned, private financiers. And yeah, I will end with these remarks and also practical steps forward, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's been a fascinating context setting. I think what we've learned is how much early investment was put in place, for the policy framework to emerge for natural climate solutions to be able to be part of the solution. And of course, it doesn't need to be said that these natural climate solution investments and approaches to water also have tremendous implications in terms of gender equity, as we heard, but also for carbon sequestration, because most of these strategies are very climate forward, for biodiversity, for rural livelihoods, for indigenous rights. So this is a very powerful strategy that has implications far and beyond water. We also heard about the challenges. Jenna, that was an excellent summation of the challenges that you were facing in Peru in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of actually getting the funds expended, in terms of, and Helen, I think you mentioned this too, the challenges around just monitoring and measurement. Gabriel, your comments were very helpful in terms of how you can expand this from Peru to other places and what some of the limitations are. So thank you all for that excellent context setting. We've had lots of great questions come in. And I think that where I'd like to start is really at the very practical level. We've had some questions probably directed to you, Jenna, but I think other panelists can respond as well. I think there is a hunger for just some examples of the specific interventions that are happening in natural climate solutions and which ones have been the most effective. And maybe you could just describe a couple of examples, Jenna, to help us ground ourselves in the solutions.
Sure, thanks, Bettina. So as I mentioned, one of the most common interventions that we see in the projects that we evaluated in this report is reforestation or afforestation. So in the textual analysis, it was a little bit difficult to be able to assess which was which, so we grouped them together. And it's interesting to note that there is this emphasis in the Peruvian public investment in natural infrastructure to plant trees, to implement infiltration canals. There's a lot more emphasis on restoring, and you could think of it as kind of building natural infrastructure instead of conserving or maintaining what already exists. And that's a bit of an artifact of applying the public investment logic that allows one to build gray infrastructure with public funds to natural infrastructure. So it also points to kind of an area where we'd like to introduce kind of a bit more flexibility and recognition for the particular aspects of natural infrastructure in the public investment conceptual framework that guides it. But we see a lot of reforestation and afforestation, and a lot of that can help significantly with water supplies. So for example, the first compensation mechanism for ecosystem services that was actually implemented in coordination with the regional government in an Andean Amazonian town with a relatively small watershed that supplied water for their municipal water supply, a place called Moyobamba in San Martin. They focused their first tariff through a public investment project that focused on reforesting areas in a small watershed that supplies water in order to recover forests, montane forests, tropical montane Andean forests in an area that was important for water supply. So that helps to reduce erosion and sedimentation that impacts the water supply, and also helps with some regulation on kind of a more day-to-day basis, in this case, more of an Amazonian setting. In other places, you might have restoration of wetlands or construction of infiltration ditches that are also associated with some reforestation or afforestation alongside the infiltration ditches that allow for aquifer recharge, for infiltration, also reducing runoff and therefore erosion that can impact water supplies downstream. So there's a range of types of interventions depending on where you are, but those are roughly kind of the types of activities that are taking place with these funds.
Great, thank you so much. Have a question for Gabriel, who I'm sure was very involved in all of those policy interventions in 2013, 14, 15, and actually getting ecosystem services and natural climate solutions. I'm sure you had a hand in this. But this is a question from, hold on one second, from our friend Marta Echeverria. Hello, Marta. And she is curious about the context in Peru when these policy changes were introduced, and whether you see that as being unique to Peru, or in your current role, whether you see these seeds being sown in other governments across Latin America. So was the situation unique to Peru, or are these policy changes and approaches to natural-based solutions things that are happening in other countries? And if so, where are the promising seeds right now?
I think that the possibility of replicating some of the successes of the Peruvian experience are there. The possibility, because many of these things that have been fundamental to build this Peruvian model come from evaluating previous experiences. As I said before, Peru was entered later than other in these discussions, and was able to benefit from discussions happening before in Ecuador, in Costa Rica, in Colombia, or in Mexico, and in other places. So what I think is different is this involvement, for instance, of these partners that are a little bit strange in certain other places, as the water regulator, for instance. But when I work at TNC, we were working very closely with SUNAS, for instance, in their effort to take the model of the incorporation of the ecosystem services approach into ADERASA, that is the regional body where all the water regulators of the Americas are involved. So I think this kind of effort could be replicated, and I think the regional bodies where countries are part of, I think can be fundamental. Is a good news that after 10 years of abandoning and going out from the environmental discussion, that the Andean community is back. Sad that they lost 10 years, but yeah, it's good for them to be back. It's good for the Amazon Treaty Cooperation Organization to be back alive and to be again being present and being active. So I think getting in touch with them and see how these experiences can be taken and can be something interesting to discuss in these intergovernmental bodies is something that we should explore definitely for the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Gabriel. And Helen, I think you mentioned China and a few other countries that are really advancing their practices around nature-based solutions. And just curious whether you wanted to comment on where you see some really interesting innovation globally and what are the lessons there for Peru and other countries in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, we see developments all over the world. Exactly. I mentioned China. I also mentioned the UK, but actually the trend of nature-based solutions countries are really looking into this. We worked with Mexico and the UK for a case study and how they advance nature-based solutions. We also see movements in the European Union, also related to the taxonomy that specifies nature-based solutions as an investment area. So I think these trends simply show that overall nature-based solutions are of interest in all parts of the world. Maybe also looking in the Latin American context, I think their water funds are pretty prominent. And first developed in Ecuador. I think that could also be, maybe a source of inspiration to loop in private beneficiaries. I know that their food and beverage companies can also provide funding for nature-based solutions. And Peru could maybe explore opportunities to find benefits also for stakeholders from industry or other sectors there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another question that has come in is around, some of the co-benefits that are produced. It's related to the co-benefits that are produced by sort of nature-based solutions to water. And so, one of the challenges, of course, is that, when you implement one of these projects, like the ones that you were describing, Jenna, around reforestation, it's not just a benefit to water, it's a benefit to carbon, it's a benefit to biodiversity, and so on. And so the question is, how do you introduce additional financing vehicles that can sit alongside the water-based funding to implement these solutions at larger scale? And the one question from the audience is specifically around habitat banking and new legislation that's being introduced in Peru around habitat banking. So could you and perhaps Gabriel and others speak to what's happening with habitat banking in Peru? Can it sit next to nature-based solutions for water and water tariffs? And how do you see all of these different funding sources coming together to better scale up nature-based solutions?
Gabrielle, I think I'll let you take a shot at that one first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think water has been being visible, has been the ecosystem service that has been more successful in terms of entering the minds and being able to be operationalized and under this approach or this idea that there was the background of the law of the mereces, of the retribution mechanisms. But I think recognizing this, we must go back to understand the integrality of the nature-based solution interventions. So water is one aspect of these investments or these things we need to care about. So I see a natural evolution in terms of projects and intervention being in the future. Also taking care of forest ecosystem services and the impact on biodiversity. So what is happening with this discussion around banking is something that it's the natural evolution for this discussion. This will generate much more complications in terms of having a set of different things to care about, but I think that's the natural way to go in terms of understanding the complexity of ecosystems. So I think the first steps have been successful, but we now need to try to understand how do we incorporate these other points of view or these other angles to the discussion on how we put nature to work with us in terms of solving development problems such as water availability or water quality in the future.
Jenna, do you have anything to add to that, or Helen, about how water funding can sit next to habitat banking, carbon, or other forms of ecosystem service financing?
Yeah, shall I go first? Yeah, I mean, we in our work, we always see it as an opportunity to actually attract new sources of funding, and that it's an opportunity for the water sphere, for the water sector to loop in new stakeholders, and that's why I said why cross sectoral cooperation is vital to work together. And through, like, over the world, we do see examples where we have offset markets, environmental offset markets, blue credits, carbon credits that can actually help funding these investments. Because often for nature-based solutions, it's difficult to find or to generate a funding stream, and therefore it's difficult to make the investment case for those investments. And what helps to overcome that challenge is to generate somehow a stable revenue stream over time. So carbon offset markets, or in general environmental offset markets, can be great solutions and a source of revenues that can pay back investments. We can also try to loop in insurances because nature-based solutions can protect against climate risks. We also had a last roundtable with a focus on climate action. And what we see here is that there is a lot of finance available for climate objectives in general. So again, that's an opportunity for nature-based solutions related to water to actually tap into this available finance if we manage to create the link and to highlight the benefits that these investments can deliver also for climate objectives or other societal objectives.
I think, yes, I think I would just add to that, and I think certainly share your kind of vision and enthusiasm for the possibility of kind of stacking these multiple values, Helen. And I think maybe to go back to what we're all saying in some way is the ability to be able to attract this finance based on the value of the water benefits generated by ecosystems is very special. That's been able to generate this the revenues that we've been able to mobilize so far. In some cases, they're kind of one time for each project that are approved by regional governments or local governments. In other places, they're renewing tariffs that come from water utilities. So both of them are renewable sources of local finance that can be really important for ensuring that these watershed ecosystems are conserved and restored. In our view, it's really important to make sure that investments are designed in order to kind of respond to those particular risks. And it's been an important learning curve to be able to see how there might be some trade-offs with kind of carbon benefits that you might be seeking to achieve on a landscape, or biodiversity benefits you might be seeking to achieve. So it's really important to make sure you're clear on what your objective is, also what the potential trade-offs are, and be able to make that case. What we see in Peru, and I think an important learning curve for everyone involved, has been there's some, real limits to be able to stack different sources of finance because of the financing and implementation mechanisms that we're required to follow in order to mobilize these public funds. And that's going to be really different depending on which country you're in and what the particular regulatory frameworks are. I think it would be super helpful to generate some lessons around how some of those frameworks have been able to be more flexible in a way that supports really robust and helpful collaboration with private sector, with other funding streams that would support Peru, for example, to be able to integrate maybe carbon funding streams from the private sector in a way that could help to accelerate or expand impacts from, that's based originally on the water finance. That's not possible right now. So it's important to be clear about what's possible or what's not possible and why, and what are the kind of characteristics of the regulatory framework that make that the case or not, and then also move towards a more flexible system that allows us to have more blending. But because that's not possible right now in the kind of project finance logic that we have to follow, it's more of a complementary finance that you can generate over time or on the landscape. And that requires just kind of coordination among the actors who are working in the regions.
Gabriel, did you raise your hand? Did you want to add anything else?
Yes, something that I heard in an event in Colombia regarding deforestation-free production chains, someone coming from the private sector, from the company producing chocolates, and saying, keep it simple. Please keep it simple, because if you can make it for morons, then it's better. Because if not, we will not engage. So don't try to explain us about the logic of the something related to the logic of the public investment, because we won't buy that.
That's a good point. Keep it simple. Always really good advice. So going to change the theme a little bit to the social side. We had a question come in and a concern that when you have external funding, whether it's from public parties or from private parties, and that leads to projects like you were describing, Jenna, so reforestation, afforestation projects, changes in land use, a concern about how local communities and indigenous communities might be impacted, and what is this consortium doing to protect and give voice to local communities?
Sure, thank you, Bettina. So our approach to engaging local communities is to engage them from the beginning of the project development, the actual development of what is going to happen on a territorial basis, to identify what would be their interests, what would they like to see happen on their landscape. A lot of Andean communities in particular understand and have kind of a historical and a cultural appreciation of the importance of ecosystems in their territories and ancestral practices that help them to manage their own water risks, which then cascade down to benefiting or managing water risks at the level of the watershed. So a lot of times there is opening and interest from local communities in engaging in these types of projects, because they also see how they'll benefit beyond the investment in their community and what that might mean for local jobs, et cetera. They're interested oftentimes directly in the interventions that will happen in their territory. But that also requires a significant process of listening, understanding what their interests are, what they are not interested in doing, socializing it, several different moments, making sure that different groups in the community understand really what the projects will entail. And there's always formal agreements with the communities before any projects move forward. So there are safeguards in place. A lot of that comes from the public investment sector and the projects where we are engaged. We also emphasize that and help to support counterparts in water utilities or regional governments to be able to do that well. There's also some limits to how much you can do on that side because of how the system works. So I saw one question, I think, about whether it's possible for local groups or local communities to propose ideas, like a kind of grant funding, where there's solicitations for proposals, and it's really the ideas are coming from the local communities instead of kind of developed in a co-creation process that sort of happens now. And that's not a model that is really possible with the current kind of procurement rules that guide these public investment projects. So that would be another area where we would love to see kind of more flexibility, recognizing that that kind of approach will support the sustainability and the effectiveness of the initiatives themselves over time. And then just, I think one other thing to note that might be interesting for other places also that we found is it's really important to have clarity when you go in to begin the project development process about what is motivating the funds, what needs to happen in term to be able to ensure that the investment itself is justified. So what is the kind of menu of options that could be on the table? We have found that in a lot of these communities, this idea of kind of a ecosystem services project for generating water benefits is very new. When public actors have come to propose projects in the past, they're usually about improving agricultural production or maybe creating some sort of wood plantation or some other kind of local project to meet local needs. And so the dynamics are different in the way that the types of activities that can be justified under these types of projects are different. And that requires a lot of care at the beginning to communicate that well and ensure that the counterpart has the knowledge that they need in order to fully engage productively in that process.
Great. And I'm going to ask a closing question. We're actually at the end of almost at the end of our time. And it is around, what we know is what gets measured gets done. What gets measured gets focused on. There are questions, in the chat about gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure and, what is being spent on each. And of course, the great advantage gray infrastructure has is it has these great sort of just, measurements and forecasts, which doesn't mean that they're necessarily right, but they have, sort of historic metrics. And so, there's questions about, where are we in terms of having a sort of a robust accounting for the impacts from these projects, because that is obviously a really important measure to scale this and to really attract private capital. And if you could speak to, and if any of the panelists can speak to that briefly.
I can mention what we're doing, and then I think Gabrielle and Helen both have ideas also, so that would be great to hear from everyone. So in Peru, our project has been doing a lot of work to help to address this gap, and I'll mention a couple of tools that might also be of interest to folks in the audience. So we'll just classify what you need to have the ex-ante estimation of the benefits. What do you expect to get from natural infrastructure? Very difficult to do in places like Peru, where there isn't a lot of historical data, and setting up hydrological models can be a long, complicated, expensive process that is inaccessible to a lot of these projects. And so on that ex-ante side, we've developed a series of methodologies that's called CUBIC, C-U-B-H-I-C. These are methodologies that are very simple and support site-level quantification of benefits in terms of water quality, basically focused on mass balance equations that help to estimate infiltration and reducing erosion. So that's something we think is really practical, possible to apply in all projects, and should help to improve also the design in order to improve the benefits that are generated. On the ex post side, you have to monitor, and there's a lot of capacity building and awareness raising that needs to happen also with the sources of finance to make sure that they're allocating money to go towards monitoring and not only to the implementation. The water sector in Peru engaging in these investments has been a great advocate and promoter for ensuring that every single one of their projects and promoting that this happens in other sectors also includes specific budget for monitoring. We're working with the water sector and with the environment sector to implement a number of new monitoring systems. And in the next couple of months, we'll be coming out with a new series of monitoring protocols that aim to kind of help to make this approach more systematic and comparable across projects.
Great, thank you, Jenna. Gabriel?
This discussion around monitoring is something that happens when you involve the Ministry of Economy and Finance, because all this process they have been pushing for public investment and to be under this new idea of the results-based management, then creates the necessity to have indicators and to have to be able to prove that the interventions you are having are generating a specific outcome. And this is something we discussed long before with colleagues such as Bert de Vievre. He always told me all the experience regarding the effect of nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure in South America or in the Andes are much more related to the places where the ecosystems are páramos, which are these ones that come from Costa Rica all down and end in Peru, in Colombia, where the Andes start to get drier, and then they reach Argentina and Chile, where they are completely dry. So this challenge has been taken by the project in terms of how do we show how things happen in this other type of ecosystems that are different from the páramos, that might look similar, but have other different characteristics than those happening in Colombia or in Ecuador, where much more information is available. And this is something extremely valuable that the project generates.
Thank you so much. Helen, any quick observations?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think also the problem is a bit two-sided. On the one hand, it's how do we actually measure the performance? How do we do this technically? How can we monetize environmental benefits? And the other difficulty is that also, as Jenna said, we don't have much experience. Nature-based solutions are quite new, so it's difficult to look at long experiences and records that we can predict, okay, this is the investment and this will be exactly the benefit. Actually, countries often say, well, the benefit might range from this to this, and this is difficult to make an investment case. So what we see as solutions around the world to try to face these barriers, I mean, pilot projects for nature-based solutions can help to build this experience, this record, and to test performance. So, for example, I'm just giving examples from the world. In the EU, we have the Horizon 20 project that finances pilots for nature-based solutions. So that can help overcome these uncertainties. Also, we see initiatives in different countries. France has launched a research project to actually evaluate their ecosystems and ecosystem services and trying to monetize it. And there are also options to actually overcome this uncertainty of performance or risk of which creates performance risks also for investors. There are examples of performance-based financing mechanisms. For example, in the US, a nature-based solution has been financed with an arrangement where they say, well, if this performs at this level, there will be an extra payment for investors. Or if it underperforms, then investors will have to give an extra amount of money to upgrade the infrastructure. So that is a way actually to also share this risk related to nature-based solutions and the performance uncertainty, and to share it among investors and overcome that barrier.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate that. There have been amazing questions, and we've been able only to address a small portion of them, but we will have another chance on March 10th when we have a follow-up webinar, which you are all invited to. The recording of this session will be available on the Forest Trends YouTube channel and via on-demand registration through Zoom. And of course, the report that you heard Jenna describe and that we were discussing is available on Forest Trends website. And please look out for a follow-up message in the coming days with all of this material. And with that, we thank you very much for your very active participation. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Forest Trends. And thank you to all of the members of this coalition. And thank you very much to USAID and to Canada for your support of this project. And with that, we are at the end.